Can everyone hear me okay? All right, take that as a yes. So, yes, my topic is the mind, diet, and brain health. So, when I was trying to pick a topic for the research reviews, I thought of dementia because my fiance's grandma has dementia, and I just wanted to see if there was anything that we could do as dietitians to help folks like her and her family who, like, his mom every day calls her and says, take your pills, and it's shower day, and having to remind her of things all the time. And so I wanted to see if there was any sort of nutrition related things that we could do for those people and their families. So as I was researching, I found the Mind Diet, and I had never heard of it before, so I thought that was really interesting and new, and I wanted to find out more about it. So that's why I chose this topic. So, to give you a little bit of an outline of what I'm going to be going over today, I'm first going to overview what the Mind Diet is, and then we're going to go through my 3 studies and compare and contrast the studies, and then make some conclusions and some possible implications for our practice as RDs. So my objectives were to understand the components of the Mind Diet, to review my 3 research articles, and then make some conclusions again and give some possible implications for our practice. So starting out with what the Mind Diet is. So MIND stands for Mediterranean-Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. And that's a mouthful, so I'm just going to stick with Mind Diet throughout the presentation. And it is comprised of 15 components. So we've got 10 quote unquote brain healthy foods, and then 5 unhealthy foods that should be limited for this diet. So the healthy foods include green leafy vegetables, other vegetables, berries, nuts, olive oil, whole grains, fish, beans, poultry, and red wine. And then the 5 that should be limited are butter and stick margarine, cheese, red meat, fried and fast foods, and sweets. And I really liked this little picture here for you so you can get a better visual of what the diet is. So it really is a healthy mix between the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. So some general guidelines. Daily, you should be having 3 servings of whole grains a day, a salad, a vegetable, and a glass of wine. On most days, having nuts as a snack and beans, and then weekly, at least 2 servings of poultry and berries, and at least 1 serving of fish a week. And then limiting those items in the unhealthy list, specifically butter and margarine to 1 tablespoon a day, and then 1 serving of either cheese, fried food, or fast food. So comparing it with the Mediterranean and DASH diet, it doesn't specify high fruit consumption like the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. It doesn't specify high potato consumption like the Mediterranean diet. And it doesn't specify high dairy consumption like the DASH diet, and no high fish consumption like the Mediterranean diet. So basically, it emphasizes natural and plant-based foods, and in particular, berries and green leafy vegetables, because the research shows that these slow cognitive decline. And then it's limited in high saturated fat and animal-based foods. So to jump into my 3 research articles, the first one is the Mind Diet associated with reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease. And I have these 3 listed in chronological order here for you. This first one is from 2015. So this was an observational study. Its purpose was to study the correlation between the Mind Diet, the Mediterranean diet, and the DASH diet with Alzheimer's disease. They used 1,300 participants from the Rush Memory and Aging Project, which was another study that was being done, and they used their pool of participants for their study. And they invited them to complete annual food frequency questionnaires and neuropsychological assessments. And at baseline, these participants were required to not have known dementia. So the diet evaluation they used was the modified Harvard semi-quantitative food frequency questionnaire. And it was a list of 144 foods that they had to report their usual frequency of consumption over the past 12 months. And then they were given a diet score based on each of the diets. So here I've made a chart of each of the diets and the way that they scored them. So for the DASH diet, they took 10 components and scored them either 0, 0.5, or 1 for a max total of 10. The Mediterranean diet, they took the 11 components and gave them either a 0 or a 5. And then for the MIND diet, they did the 15 components that I listed earlier, and their max score was 15. So for cognitive evaluation, they did this mainly for diagnosing them with Alzheimer's. So they used 21 cognitive performance tests, which assessed a range of cognitive abilities in the 5 cognitive domains, as well as their overall cognitive function. So for their Alzheimer's diagnosis, they used the criteria from both of these associations to do so with a trained clinician. And then they also took other non-dietary variables into consideration for their analyses. They used some basic demographics, as well as things like years of education, frequency of cognitively stimulating activities, physical activity, depressive symptoms, and then some histories, including like hypertension, MI, diabetes, as well as stroke. But most importantly, they did this APOE genotype, which studies show that the APOE4 genotype is more likely to have Alzheimer's disease than the other genotypes. So they were really looking at this one to see what their predisposed ability, I guess, was. So this is their results. Here they're expressed as odds ratios. So the first tertile is used as their reference, which basically means that if 100% of those participants would eventually develop Alzheimer's, this is the likelihood that the participants in tertiles 2 and 3 would develop Alzheimer's as well. So overall, they had 144 cases develop, and the average time between the first diet assessment and diagnosis was 3.8 years. So a relatively short period of time between these two as far as development of Alzheimer's goes. And then when they age adjusted the models, the diet score was significantly associated with lower risk of Alzheimer's. Here we can see in this P trend here. And then when they basic adjusted it, meaning they adjusted for the age plus sex, education, that APOE4, energy intake, physical activity, and the frequency of their cognitively stimulating activities. So here, the top tertile was 53% reduced, and the middle was 35% reduced in the development rate when compared with this lowest tertile, their reference. So then for the DASH diet, only the top tertile was associated significantly, as well as the Mediterranean diet. And then this third model here, the basic and condition adjusted, means that they adjusted additionally for the diabetes, the hypertension, the stroke, and the MI. And they found that the results here were very similar to the age adjusted, meaning that these factors weren't very significant with the development of Alzheimer's disease. So, in conclusion, they said that their study provides evidence that even a mild to moderate adherence to the overall diet pattern may protect against development of Alzheimer's disease. This was also found in previous studies to be similar. And then higher DASH diet scores had a lower protective association. And then on the other hand, the MIND diet, the Mediterranean diet does have a protective association in some, but not all studies. The study showed that it was only the top tertile that had a protective association significantly. So strengths and limitations of this study, I did give this a neutral rating. Its strengths were that its design minimized selection bias using that pool of participants from the other study. Their diagnosis was based on annual testing and structured evaluations, and they used blinding for their clinicians who were doing the measurements. And then their diet pattern scores were based on a comprehensive food frequency questionnaire that was validated. The limitations of their study was that their design as an observational study can't determine a true causal relationship, and they relied on limited information from the food frequency questionnaire. So specifically, the example that they gave was their question for berries was only associated with strawberries and no other types of berries. So they also noted that the limited information would have meant that their results were less significant than if they were more specific. And then their relatively short average period from their initial assessment to disease. So like I said, it was only 3.8 years on average. So that was pretty short when it comes to Alzheimer's development. So then my second study was adherence to the MIND diet and the prevalence of psychological disorders in adults. And this one was from 2019. So this again was an observational study. Their purpose was to examine the association between adherence to the MIND diet and psychological disorders. So this was an Iranian study, and they used 3,176 participants from another study called the Study on the Epidemiology of Psychological Alimentary Health and Nutrition Project. For this one, they asked their participants to complete demographic medical history questionnaires and food frequency questionnaires, as well as psychological assessments. For their dietary evaluation, they also used a food frequency questionnaire that was validated for their population, in which their participants had to report on 106 foods and mixed dishes based on 6 to 9 multiple choice responses, which varied from never or less than once per month to 12 or more times per day. And then the score that they gave them was based on the 15 dietary components minus olive oil and wine because they lacked information from their questionnaire for that. And then their participants were each classified into 3 tertiles based on the brain healthy foods and the unhealthy foods. And then they gave them a total MIND diet score based on their calculations for each component. Their psychological evaluation that they did was they used the hospital anxiety and depression scale as well as the general health questionnaire. For the HADS, they assessed their psychological disorders and severity of depression and anxiety. They used a max score of 21 and considered 0 to 7 as normal and then 8 or above as being a psychological disorder. And then the general questionnaire, they used that to assess the psychological distress of their participants and gave them a max score of 12, but 4 or above was considered psychological distress for them. And then Their non-dietary variables were also some basic demographics, as well as smoking status, antidepressant use, vitamin supplement use, and physical activity. Their results are also expressed as odds ratios, and the first quartile used as reference. Overall, the prevalence of depression was 26.4%, anxiety was 11.9%, and psychological distress was 20.9%. And according to these results, the study was significantly different based on sex. So here I have the men, and then on the next slide I'll have the women's chart. Model 1 here is adjusted for age and energy intake. And then model 2 is age plus marital status, education, vitamin supplement use, smoking, and physical activity. And then model 3 was adjusted for BMI. So for depression, as well as psychological distress, there was a significant association. There was an association between all three of them, but these were the only two that were significant among men. Oh, sorry, that was for the women. So yes, the women were statistically significant for depression and psychological distress, but not anxiety, even though they saw impacts for all three. The men, they found no significant results for all three of these. So in conclusion, they said that adherence to the MIND diet was significantly associated with lowering depression and psychological distress, but not anxiety within the whole population. And yes, these weren't seen in men, but prevalence of psychological disorders has been shown to be higher among women than it is among men. So they also noted that due to a lack of studies on the MIND diet and anxiety, these findings would need to be reproduced to come to a solid conclusion. So I did give this study a positive rating. Its strengths were that it was one of the first studies of its kind looking at psychological distress. It had a large sample size of over 3,000, and they used confounding variables for controlling their results. They did have some limitations, which were their observational study design. The data only represents the initial step in the relationship, meaning that because it was one of the first studies, they can't come to a solid conclusion yet because they have no other evidence. And then their data was, they didn't have any data on menopause, olive oil, or wine, which olive oil and wine are pretty significant for the diet. But menopause, they said, wouldn't have been as apparent in their population because it was 18 to 55, so it shouldn't have made much of a difference for their participants. And then my third study is the MIND diet and slowing cognitive decline after stroke. So this one was again from 2019. So this was also an observational study, and they were looking to determine if the MIND diet was effective in preventing cognitive decline after stroke. So they actually also used the same participants from that first study, which also used participants from the Rush Memory and Aging Project. This study, because of their limitation of having to have a history of stroke for their participants, they only had 106. So again, the participants had to complete annual food frequency questionnaires and neuropsychological assessments. And then just to review a little bit, the dietary evaluation was the same as the first one, so 144 foods over the past 12 months, and then they were given a score on each of the 3 diets. So again, DASH max of 10, Mediterranean diet, max of 55, and then the MIND diet, max of 15. Their cognitive evaluation, again, was the same as before, 21 tests, and then they looked more specifically at each of the 5 domains, which are episodic memory, semantic memory, working memory, visual spatial, and perceptual speed, as well as global cognitive function, meaning overall cognitive function. And then the non-dietary variables were the same as before, but they were more interested in whether or not their patients had a history of stroke. So for their results, this table was adjusted for age, sex, education, the APOE4, frequency of cognitive activities, caloric intake, physical activity, and smoking. So pretty well-rounded on what factors would affect brain health. So they found that a high adherence to the MIND diet was associated with slower decline in global cognition, semantic memory, and perceptual speed. However, it was only statistically significant for global cognition and semantic memory. And then they found that a moderate adherence, meaning this tertile 2, was not significantly associated with slowing decline. And then the Mediterranean and DASH diets didn't have any statistically significant evidence of slowing cognitive decline either. So in conclusion for this study, the MIND diet significantly slows the rate of decline in global cognition, semantic memory, and perceptual speed. And then the Mediterranean diets and DASH diets were not associated with slowing decline after stroke. The study also suggests that the estimated effect on stroke survivors was double than that was observed for the overall MAP cohort. And then they said that future studies would be necessary to explore the role of the MIND diet in preventing cognitive decline after stroke. So despite many studies advocating the role of diet, both in stroke prevention and the prevention of cognitive decline, there are very few studies that examine the role of diet in preventing cognitive decline in subjects specifically with a history of stroke. So even though this population is at higher risk, there's no studies really being done on them because they are deemed like a sensitive population. So as far as strengths, I did give this a positive rating as well. They used a validated food frequency questionnaire. They measured cognitive changes with a large number of standardized tests, and they used the control of confounding factors for their results. Limitations they had, again, it was an observational study, so they can't really have any strong evidence for a causal relationship. They used a very small sample size, being only 100, but again, stroke survivors aren't really part of studies very often. Most of the time they're ruled out. So history of stroke in this case was determined by self-report, which was also a limitation. And like the first one, they noted that if they had more specific information, then their results would not have been as significant as they were. And they also said that their findings can't be generalized to other populations. So comparing these 3 studies, they all found that adherence to the MIND diet was beneficial to brain health. And then I also found a few other studies that also supported the MIND diet, one of them being the MIND diet slows cognitive decline with aging, which found that the MIND diet substantially slowed cognitive decline with age. And then the second one being association of long-term adherence to the MIND diet and cognitive decline in American women, which said that long-term adherence to the MIND diet was moderately associated with better verbal memory in later life. And then the last one I found was the MIND diet, not Mediterranean diet, related to 12-year incidence of cognitive impairment in an Australian longitudinal cohort study. And they found that the MIND diet protective effects can be generalized to populations outside of the US. That study was done in Australia again. So, strengths and limitations of my 3 research articles. Again, 2 of them were from the same pool of participants, so they had very similar strengths and limitations. All 3 studies used validated research methods, and all 3 adjusted their results for confounding factors that could interfere with cognitive decline. And then all 3 for limitations, they were all 3 observational studies, and there were more limitations between them than there were strengths. So because these studies were all done within the past 5 years, I would say that this is a pretty new and emerging topic for our practice, so it's something good to know about. So, implications for our practice. The research studies show promising evidence that the MIND diet can slow decline in cognition and possibly ease psychological distress. There's new research that could give us a new diet, maybe, or at least information to educate our clients on who have possibility of a decline in cognition or a greater decline in cognition. So I don't mean to say that this diet should be put into practice right now, but it's good to know about, and with more solid research, it could be a new diet that we're educating on. All I ask is that you consider it the next time someone asks you for something to help them with their brain health or cognitive decline in general. So with that, we will start our questions. And I have my references here as well.
Okay. Thank you, Jessie. So we will open it up to questions now. Like Wendy told you, if you do have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box to the right. And then I will read the question out loud for all of us. So I'll give you all a few moments to type any of those questions.
All right. Can you see me now?
Yep.
All right, perfect.
All right, Jessica. Heather would like to know, did anything surprise you about the study results?
I mean, I know things like the berries and the green leafy vegetables have those antioxidants in them and all those good vitamins and minerals. So I figured that increasing those things would help with brain function, just because of how antioxidants work. So, I mean, a little bit thinking that just even a minimal amount of more berry consumption in the diet would increase protective effects, I guess. So, yeah, I guess the moderate ones were the ones that surprised me more than the high adherence, because that first study did say that even kind of following it, like moderately following it, was better associated.
Any last minute questions anybody has?
Guess that means I did a good job.
All right. So thank you again, Jessie. Before we leave, if you could remember to click on the link for Jessie's feedback for her presentation in the chat box. And then you are free to choose your next presentation, which begins at 9:50. And Wendy just provided the links for both of those presentations in the chat box as well. So we will minutes, and thank you. Thank you again, Jessie.
Thank you.